I wanted to check out this interview that Netanyahu did with the American press. He went on CNN to respond to Chuck Schumer. Now, for those of you who have not been following, Chuck Schumer did a big speech in the Senate where he pounded Netanyahu. Now, he went after Hamas, he went after a bunch of people, but he laid down 4 barriers to peace. And of the 4 barriers, one of whom was Netanyahu's government. And he said that Netanyahu, as somebody who completely rejects the idea of a Palestinian state, as somebody who has gone after Israel's democratic institutions, and a bunch of other reasons. You can go watch the speech on your own if you want. You can also watch it at DylanBurnsLIVE on my second channel. We've covered it on the channel as well if you wanted to get my commentary on the speech. But point is, Netanyahu got the message from Chuck Schumer, America's leading Jewish politician and the #1 ranking Democrat in the Senate, one of the most powerful Democrats in the entire country, coming out against him directly and saying he is a barrier to peace. He reacts on American television. He wants to get ahead of the narrative. So let's see what he has to say to Chuck Schumer's verbal onslaught.
Here with me now is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's start with that potential deal, sir. 100 hostages are still being held by Hamas. You're sending that negotiating team to Qatar in the coming days.
I gotta just say, Netanyahu just has he has a flowery presence. When he enters the room and you see this face, you just know you're dealing with a real saint here. This is a guy that if we were making folk tales of today's times for the future, he'd be our Saint Nick, our Santa Claus. Look at this guy. Just sunshine and rainbows flowing out from his ears. Huh? Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm being sassy. I'm being a little sassy today. Let's get back into it.
To talk about a potential deal, free hostages in exchange for a 6-week pause in fighting. As you know, Hamas is demanding the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for roughly 40 female hostages.
Those are not bags under his eyes. Those are dump trucks. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. Continuing.
Are you open to that? Are you close to a deal?
Well, time will tell, but Hamas's outlandish demands, and I'm not itemizing every one of them now, makes that deal a lot more difficult, but we're going to keep on trying because we want those hostages back. We understand also that the one thing that gets Hamas to give them is to give these hostages to us is the continued military pressure that we're applying there. So we're going to continue military pressure, and we're going to continue to try to get those hostages out. And we've succeeded already in bringing half of them out. I hope we continue along that same course.
Let's talk about what happened here in the U.S. this week. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer gave a pivotal speech and said, you have lost your way, and called you an obstacle to peace. Take a listen.
The Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th.
It never did, by the way.
And I believe that holding a new election, once the war starts to wind down, would give Israelis an opportunity to express their vision for the post-war future.
Chuck Schumer is the highest-ranking Jewish elected official here in America, a staunch supporter of Israel. What's your response?
I think what he said is totally inappropriate. It's inappropriate for to go to a sister democracy and try to replace the elected leadership there. That's something that the Israeli public does on its own, and we're not a banana republic. I think the only government that we should be working on to bring down now is the terrorist tyranny in Gaza, the Hamas tyranny that murdered over 1,000 Israelis, including some dozens of Americans, and is holding Americans and Israelis hostage. That's what we should be focused on. And as far as what's...
Okay, so can I just quickly throw out there that if we're talking about making long-term peace, just winning a war over the Palestinians doesn't necessarily just bring about peace. Like, okay, we've lost, we give up this time. Like, that hasn't brought about peace any of the other times, like maybe for like a certain period, but it always comes back up again. And so from an American perspective, if we're looking at the foundation for stability getting laid down right now, what, ingredients we need to make this long-term peace viable to make it so that the Israelis and Palestinians, everybody in the region, can live together, not have to love each other, but can exist with the others existing, that is going to require some version of a representative state government, whatever you want to call it, for Palestinians where they can govern their own affairs outside of the arm of the Israeli government. The Israeli government and the Palestinians and the Israeli society and the Palestinian society have so many differences, so much hatred and bad blood, that just absorbing all of this and trying to make it work comes with extreme risk. Any solution, because it's going to come with risk. No solution is going to be 100% perfect, but it doesn't seem like a viable solution, especially if the Israelis wanted to preserve what they view, and this is from their perspective, as the character of the Jewish state without mass expulsion, which cannot be an option for obvious humanitarian and ethnic cleansing related reasons, as in I'm against ethnic cleansing, not in favor of it. And so the only other option would be absorbing them, if you wanted to absorb them, and not giving them political rights, which I do want to say was floated by Trump's former ambassador to Israel. So while it might sound like a crazy far-right fantasy plan, it is, but that crazy far-right fantasy plan is now held by the crazy far-right maniacs that are closer to position of power than ever, and in some instances, like the former ambassador to Israel, was in positions of power in relation to this issue. And so if we want to build a strong foundation, it's going to require some acknowledgement of the need for the Palestinians to represent themselves. If we occupy Germany under the understanding that there will not be a Germany, there will not be a German state, the idea of ever agreeing to a future German state, this is ridiculous, we can never do that. Eventually, the Germans are going to start shooting us. Eventually, the Germans, there were some rebels at the start. There was this, like, I forget what they called it, if it was the Wolverines or the Badgers, the Germans had some secret operation to try to make a guerrilla war after the regime crumbled. It only went on for about a year and a half before it fell apart. But if we took over Germany and we said, nah, Germany's now the 51st state of America, and not only is it the 51st state of America, but the people who live here are not going to get voting rights, or the people who live here are going to have to leave, I don't think that would be a recipe for stability in occupied German territory.
Senator Schumer said,
you got to build the foundation for stability, and we just don't want to end up dumping money into this hole, and I don't want to call it a hole, but it will be a hole if we are just at the same place again in 10 years.
Majority of Israelis support our governments. 82% of Americans support.
It was the werewolves. Thank you very much. It was the werewolves. That's what they called them in Germany.
Israel instead of Hamas, but the majority of Israelis support the policies that we're leading. Go into Rafah, destroy the remaining
Headless chicken. Thank you so much for the primer. Appreciate it.
Hamas terrorist battalions, make sure that we don't put into Gaza, instead of Hamas, the Palestinian Authority that educates their children towards terrorism and the annihilation of Israel, and also an enormous majority here, including 99 Knesset members to 9, oppose the idea of ramming down a Palestinian state down our throats.
I want to get to some
the
of those
majority
polls.
of Israelis.
Again, the majority of Israelis, when polled, were at least open or favorable to the idea of accepting or doing a deal like the Saudi offered plan.
Wake-up call to Senator Schumer. The majority of Israelis support the policies of my government. It's not a fringe government.
It's not. If that was true, then his government would be overwhelmingly popular, which it isn't.
It represents the policies supported by the majority of the people.
There's certain policies that it has that I'm sure that they're popular, but again, we've already talked. The plan that would have a future Palestinian demilitarized state, when polled, the Israeli public were in favor of it. The Israeli public do want another election. The Israeli public don't want his government. The Israeli public were not happy about his attempts to destroy the separation between the judicial and the legislative branch, where he has a legislative majority, allowing him to then either go after or overturn the results of the Israeli Supreme Court. That was not popular. It was so unpopular. There were questions about whether members of the Israeli Air Force were going to serve because they felt that the Israeli government were going against the democratic institutions of Israel. Going into October 7th, his government had a bunch of policies that were unpopular. But after October 7th, his government only became more unpopular. That doesn't mean that everything he's done since October 7th is unpopular amongst the Israeli public. I'm not saying that. The Israeli public wanted a military operation into the Gaza Strip. But for him to claim that the Israeli public are completely in his corner when his government isn't supported by the majority of the Israeli public, and that when this war is over, they want another election, they don't want to stick with Netanyahu, yeah, he's bluffing.
If Senator Schumer opposes these policies, he's not opposing me. He's opposing the people of Israel.
Okay, I'm going to get to some of the polls that you cited in one moment, but I just want to make sure that our viewers understand that Chuck Schumer gave the big speech, but he has support in many ways from the President of the United States. President Biden is a self-described Zionist. Even he is starting to distance himself from the way you are handling the war. He called what Schumer said a good speech. He said that he shared the concern of many Americans. They aren't criticizing Israel. They're criticizing you and your right-wing coalition.
That's from CNN? Sorry, what? What channel is this? I'm sorry, is this fake NN? I'm sorry, is this CNN? Okay, I just needed to double check. Yeah, this is CNN.
Dana, there's a fallacy that is being perpetrated here. And you should take polls, you'll have your own polls, and check whether the people of Israel support the policies that I'm being criticized for. That is...
The separation, I mean, again, the polling... Why is he saying, and is he saying this because he thinks people won't go Google it? Like, if there are a few things which, for example, the majority of Israelis don't support a Palestinian state, especially after October 7th. Now, again, there's an asterisk there that once you create certain conditions, you start offering plans, or it's a demilitarized state, there's no timetable, it's in the future, then the Israeli public start to turn more and more in favor of it. It's different. But once you go into the other areas outside of that, no, that support for his policies are not overwhelming. He says this as if Haaretz and other outlets haven't done extensive reporting on the polling data on this.
Supporting the policies of going into Rafah, destroying a quarter of the remaining...
Haaretz is an Israeli news outlet, by the way.
Hamas terrorist army. That's like leaving a quarter of the Hamas, of the Nazi terrorist army in Germany, and saying, no, we're not going to finish the last quarter, and we're not going into Berlin. Most Israelis overwhelmingly support the position that we have to go in. They oppose the idea of ramming down a two-state solution or a terrorist state against their will, because...
Again, I've already explained the polling on the deal. They don't want again, in isolation, they don't want a two-state solution now, especially now in isolation, because they think it would be a reward to Hamas. But if the problem is Hamas, then what would be the problem with, from Benjamin Netanyahu's perspective, if we're just talking about that's the problem, then finishing the operation against Hamas, then creating a Palestinian state in the territory that Hamas was just pushed out of. I mean, again, it could be without a timetable. It could be just vaguely in the future. This is all the Saudis were asking for, but that's different than what he's talking about. He just doesn't want a Palestinian state, period, whether it's Hamas-led, PLO-led, Palestinian Islamic Jihad-led, Greenpeace-led, Cornel West-led, Jeb Bush, fucking Delaney from the 2016 primary, whoever.
Because they think that this will endanger Israel's future. They support those policies that I'm putting forward, and to present that as something that is, I'm an outlier, it doesn't represent the majority of the people of Israel, is simply a fallacy. And I'll tell you the other fallacy is, they're saying, well, most Palestinians don't support the Hamas massacre. In fact, 85% of the Palestinians do support, unfortunately, the Hamas massacre. So they've got two fallacies here, and you can readily check that. The majority of Israelis support the policies that I have on prosecuting the war, which is what I'm being criticized for. Well, so it's not just me. It's the people of Israel who believe that we have to...
Sorry, I was muted. When he says 85% of Palestinians support the Hamas massacre, I don't know what polling data he's referring to, and I don't know when it was done. Like, did he mean like if the question is, I just want to see the polling data. You know what? I don't even get into it. If the question is this, if the question is that, I just haven't seen the polling data.
Have this resolute victory to assure a future.
I'm not saying it's impossible that the majority of Palestinians support it, but I would imagine that if you poll Palestinians in the Gaza Strip right now about what they think about October 7th, many of them are not going to be putting out many, I guess, like tears over what happened. whether or not it was their, I mean, like, despite what they might personally think about targeting of civilians due to their current condition. Same way that if you ask a Ukrainian, like, hey, what do you think about this bomb that blew up in Belgorod? It killed some grandma, and I mean, they might even, on an individual basis, like, it sucks that grandma died, but no, I don't really care that much because look at my circumstances. Again, but I also haven't seen the polling data.
What you're being criticized.
By the way, there's not a justification for thinking that, is an explanation. You can't, you should probably understand when you're looking at polling data, if you can make that extension as to what brought that polling data about, what material conditions have changed to bring about that outcome.
Or is not prosecuting the war. It's the way that you're prosecuting the war. So I'm going to get to that in 1 minute, but I just want to add a little bit of sort of context to the way that the Biden administration is pushing back. Another way is that the U.S. intelligence community warned that, quote, distrust of Netanyahu's ability to rule has deepened and broadened across the public. And then back to the polls, you're talking about support for the idea of toppling Hamas. That makes perfect sense. There were other polls in Israel, 3 major Israeli television stations that said what Israelis also support are early elections. That's what I really want to focus on here is Senator Schumer not calling to sort of topple the government, but specifically says when the war winds down, will you commit to calling new elections? That's my question. Will you?
What's good about this question is it gets over what Netanyahu had set up as his objection, which is an election during the war. No, they want me to finish the war. There's like, okay, so after the war is over, in a month, 2 months, whenever it's over, well, then when you hold new elections, since your government is very unpopular and many people blame your government for the security failures that led to the slaughter of October 7th, which he describes with such horror, with such disgust. And it's not like Israel is unfamiliar with a quick snap election.
Dana, 2/3, first of all, what you said is wrong. The vast majority of Israelis oppose early elections until the war doesn't end. We've just had many polls on that.
What did he do? I'm sorry. She said elections after the war is over. And then he said, sorry, you're wrong. The majority of Israelis don't support the war until it doesn't end. I don't even know what he's saying. He doesn't express it well. I'm sorry. Can I hear that again?
2/3, first of all, what you said is wrong. The vast majority of Israelis oppose early elections until the war doesn't end.
What does that even mean? Until the war doesn't end? What is? I think that's just gibberish. I think he meant until the war ends. Okay, but he just fumbles on those words to the point I don't understand what he's saying. But again, she said after the war. She didn't say before the war. She said after the war. And then he's just falling back on his excuse that he had for the other question. Like he didn't hear the new question.
We've just had many polls on that. Look, a lot of the polls are twisted.
Channel 12 says, Channel 12 says 64% of Israelis support early elections.
But all polls show.
Damn.
That's not. No, I'm afraid they asked them the question, do you support it during the war? And they said no.
But that's not what Schumer's calling for.
That's not what the reporter asked for. That's not what Schumer's talking about. He's arguing with somebody who's not even in the room.
He's calling for new elections when the war winds down.
Well, we'll see when we win the war. And until we win the war, I think Israelis understand that if we were to have elections now, before the war is won.
He's just fucking falling back on it. What is going, dude? Did something break up there? Did he said, he responded to a question that wasn't asked. Then he responded to a question that wasn't asked again. So the reporter's like, yo, dude, no. Dude, this is the reporter. And then boom, again. Just the same thing again. Answer the newer question. Answer the new question. Don't respond to the question that wasn't asked.
Resoundingly won. We would have at least 6 months of national paralysis, which means we would lose the war. If we don't win the war, we lose the war. And that would be not only a defeat for Israel, but a defeat for America too, because our victory is your victory.
Okay, number one, it would not necessarily mean national paralysis. No. Number two, this, again, was not a question about during the war. It was after the war. He's still answering a question that wasn't asked.
We're fighting these barbarians that are not merely threatening the survival of Israel,
when the war winds down?
Everything that
She's doubling down.
hold dear together.
Good on her.
Will you commit to new elections when the
I
war
think
winds
that's something
down?
for the Israeli public to decide. But it's not something. No, it's
What is that? That's what an election is for, doofus. I'm sorry. That's what elections are for. It's for the public. That's how elections work. Did he just say the public should decide if there should be new election? How? What do you mean? That you would hold the new elections to see what the Israeli public see? The vast majority of polling, I have seen no polling data that indicates that once the war is over, the Israeli public doesn't want new elections. They hold Netanyahu in large part accountable for not only the disaster of October 7th, but also accountable for the mishandling of the of the hostage crisis, the hostage negotiations afterwards. His government is not loved. He's not an overwhelmingly popular man. When he says that's up to the Israeli public to decide, that's what an election's for.
Look, that's something for the Israeli people to decide. I think it's ridiculous to talk about it. It's like after 9/11, you know, after 9/11, you're in the midst of fighting the war against Al-Qaeda, and an Israeli would say, you know, what we need now is either new elections in the U.S., or if your system doesn't allow, then President Bush should resign, and we should have an alternative leader. You don't do that.
Well, let's
you don't
talk
do that
about
to,
why.
Sister.
If the majority of Americans wanted different leadership, and we had really good reason to believe, and the majority of Americans believed that George Bush was at fault for what happened on October, or I guess for 9/11, that the security failures were his fault. The thing is, George Bush was in office for like a year before 9/11. Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. The security apparatus in Israel is largely built by him and his administrations. You cannot blame George Bush for Clinton's inability to kill Osama. You cannot blame George Bush for what happened before 2001. You can blame Netanyahu, the security candidate, for failing to keep Israel secure after serving as the longest Israeli prime minister. Now, again, you would have to do a full investigation to find out exactly how much of the blame falls with him, how little of the blame. But to pretend that, why would they want a new election? I mean, come on.
A democracy to an ally, you don't talk about that. What you do talk about is how do we help you defeat what President Biden called sheer evil. You don't just stop after you destroyed 80% of sheer evil. You destroy 100% of sheer evil.
Okay, next part of the interview.
Prime Minister, I want to
Israelis
talk
and
about why
Palestinians alike.
the sentiment has changed. I mean, obviously, there has been huge support and still is really big support here in the U.S. and most corners of the world for you doing what you are saying. Your strategic goal is to defeat Hamas.
Is that true? Do the majority of the world want Israel to? I mean, it depends. Defeat Hamas, control the strip. I just don't know if that's true.
And to make sure that that kind of terror attack doesn't happen again. But what is happening, and the reason why the world is shifting in public sentiment, is the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Organizations call what they are seeing near famine in Gaza. So why won't you allow more food trucks to drive through the border crossings into Gaza to feed starving civilians while you continue to take out the terrorists in Hamas?
Well, our policy is to do exactly that. And in fact, we've enabled, our policy is to not to have famine, but to have the entry of humanitarian support as needed and as much as is needed. So we've created alternative routes, supply routes. We allow the dropping of the support from the air, humanitarian aid, a sea route that we've cooperated with, and it started yesterday, and alternative land routes that we're enabling again. The problem isn't getting the trucks in. The problem is that once they're getting in, they're looted by Hamas or looted by gangs. And what we're trying to do with some other powers is to try to get the aid to the actual civilians who need them and not looted by Hamas. That's really the problem.
Well,
in any case, that's our policy, and that's why I've enabled alternative routes of supply.
Okay.
So throwing a few things out there. First is you're not going to be able to get enough aid into the Gaza Strip through airdrop. It's just physically impossible. Not going to happen. Number two, Israel has blocked aid and did block many things like water, electricity, other services for a good part of the war. They might have stopped blocking in some areas, and they might have, after protesters have blocked certain aid shipments, then push back on those protesters eventually. But at different points in the war, they were blocking aid. And not only were they blocking aid, but they're still blocking aid through some routes for the reason that he's saying right now. But to pretend that the Israelis haven't or are not still, that's not true.
There's been a trickle, I mean, to be fair, of supply going in there, and every major
500,000 Palestinians are on the brink of famine.
NGO, outside organization involved with this crisis, says that the level of hunger is life-threatening for hundreds of thousands. Cindy McCain, who the McCain family, they have been long supporters of Israel. She is now the executive director of the World Food Program. She said that hunger has reached catastrophic levels in northern Gaza. People are dying. Only a fraction of the food needed is trickling. To prevent an outright famine, they need significant increase in humanitarian aid now. Millions of lives are at stake. Will you do that? Will you commit to that?
Of course, and we're doing it. Again, I've authorized alternative routes of supply. And again, the problem is not the number of trucks going in, although we're increasing it.
Yeah, no, it is the number of trucks. It is.
On a daily basis.
It's not the only problem, but it is.
I think the problem is preventing the looting by Hamas and by others. And that's what
I don't know how you could. It's such a fucking bold-faced lie that the number of trucks isn't a problem. Yes, number of trucks is the problem. Of course, the gangs are a problem. Of course, looting is a problem. Of course, getting it safe to civilians these are all problems. But to pretend that the number of trucks that have been getting into Gaza have been sufficient is just that the gangs are getting it all, so all these people are just starving because of the gangs. It's bull. It's bullshit. And the fact that he thinks he can say this on mainstream television and get away with it, honestly, is alarming. And I think it says something about what people think the American press will let politicians get away with.
What we're working on now. I think it's a cooperative effort. Our policy is to enable humanitarian aid. That's been a constant element in our whole program. It's to destroy Hamas militarily, but also to supply the humanitarian aid simultaneously.
Though, sir, it's not
and the main
happening.
Obstacle to that is actually Hamas.
It's not happening. Well, in the north, you said that you've destroyed Hamas. If Hamas isn't in the north, then how is Hamas taking away food? And if you open up more border crossings and give more food into the area, allow starving people to eat, the looting maybe would subside. That's human nature, no?
That's exactly what's happening, because we have increased the number of trucks entering the north. I think I'm up to date, and I know these numbers, and we know.
Okay, well, I saw somebody in chat asking me like, "Hey, Dylan, like, how many trucks should get in?" Well, I'm not like the biggest fan of the World Food Program, but here's from the World Food Program: aid trucks entering Gaza must double to meet basic needs. So to be clear, they need to double, not to meet all of their needs, but to meet the most basic needs. This was 14 days ago, and I do not believe in the last 14 days that the aid trucks have doubled. And even again, doubling would be meeting the basic needs.
Know that there is an increase, but we also know that we have a job to do to prevent the looting, because at the end we bring in the trucks, including to the north, and then they're looted by remaining Hamas terrorists. We've destroyed the fighting formations of Hamas, the terrorist battalions, but there's still individual terrorists that we're mopping up.
And I
these
understand
individual
that.
terrorists shoot the drivers, take over the goods, and try to give it to Hamas fighters, the remaining Hamas fighters. So it's an ongoing battle.
I understand
but
that.
It's something
but
that
you
we're
understand
committed
that
to.
it is the responsibility.
Destroying Hamas and giving humanitarian aid.
Forgive me. I understand that. Given the images that I'm sure you have seen, do you believe fundamentally that it is Israel's responsibility to make sure that those starving civilians, including those children...
$5. Dylan, what do you think the U.S. should do if Israel continues to block aid and a large percent of the Palestinian population ends up starving to death? If that happened,
would you call that genocide? Okay, I'm gonna try to answer the genocide question as, God, I don't want to get. Let me just be clear here. doing a bad thing in and of itself is not alone enough to do genocide. You could starve 1 million people to 2 million to 3 million people to death, and that doesn't necessarily genocide. Someone could siege a city and starve every single person in the city to death, but if the intent was not genocide, then it could possibly not be genocide. It could be completely separate. It could be that they wanted to capture the city and they were willing to do everything and anything it took to capture the city, completely regardless of the population's ethnic makeup, race, etc. So the starving element, in my opinion, whether or not more people or less people starve to death isn't necessarily going to trigger. It's not like, okay, 10 people were starving, now 15 are starving, now it's genocide. Or now this number, it could be part of a broader case to argue genocide against Israel, but you can't, I'm not going to be able to tell you, fine, when it hits 10,000, I'll admit it's a genocide. That's not how genocide cases work. That's not how genocide, that's not how genocide's referred to in academia. That's not how it's referred to in a legal setting. Yeah, so I couldn't commit to that. I could say that what should America do? I think if Israel is in a position where they are stopping aid that could get in otherwise, or has a good chance of getting in otherwise to the civilian population while the civilian population is starving, and Israel is not allowing that to happen, and they're not doing their best to take care of the population in northern Gaza, then I don't think we should assist them. And I mean, I think I've already said this before, but I don't think we should assist them in any way. And when I say anyway, I mean no military intelligence, no military aid, there should be even a question about helping to continue to supply the Iron Dome because then we're supplementing a country which isn't completing its most basic functions as to what it's supposed to do as an occupying power. Anyway, continuing. At the very least, even if you don't pull the trigger on it, you leverage it. Do what Reagan did, and I can't believe I'm saying that, but do what Reagan did. Say, fine, you're not getting the jets. If this is what you're going to do in southern Lebanon, you're not getting our jets.
You believe fundamentally that it is Israel's responsibility to make sure that those starving civilians, including those children, get food, and you're doing everything in your power to make sure that happens.
Categorically, yes. I think it's an effort that we're engaged in all the time. I think that Hamas is working on the opposite effort. One, to get people not to leave war zones. They want more civilian casualties. We want to minimize civilian casualties. And the second, they want to commandeer the humanitarian aid and bring it to their underground terror tunnels. And we want it to reach the Palestinian population. So the blame should be laid squarely at Hamas's door. And instead, I find it both cynical and wrong, just factually wrong, to try to place the blame on Israel, which is doing everything it can to minimize civilian casualties and to get to the humanitarian aid, and Hamas, which is doing the opposite. Instead of placing the blame on Hamas, we'll continue to do it regardless of the PR distortions. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is no question that Hamas is a nefarious organization doing everything it can to undermine what's going on and to create chaos. But I guess the point is that you're not Hamas. Israel is a democracy, and as a Jewish state, supports and believes in every life mattering. And so I'm glad to hear that you say that you're going to do what you can to get those aid trucks in. And obviously we'll be watching, and I'm sure a lot of organizations are going to be happy to hear what you said today. Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. I appreciate your time.
Words are one thing, action are another things. We'll wait until we see action, then I'll be happy. Him speaking doesn't make me happy. It actually makes me quite annoyed.